It's my great pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Katie Fiorella. And as you can see from her introductory slide, where she positions herself here on campus, I want to fill you in a little bit more on who she is and what she does. Katie is an environmental scientist and epidemiologist whose research aims to understand the interactions among environmental change and livelihood, food, and nutritional security. Her work is focused on global fisheries and the households that are reliant on the environment to access food and income. Katie also heads up the Food Systems and Health Concentration area and Cornell's Masters of Public Health program. And she has many other roles and responsibilities and titles on campus. If you want to learn more about Katie's background, as you know, you can access her bio on our website. She's very well credentialed. She has degrees from Princeton and from Berkeley. And it's my great pleasure to welcome her here today to speak to us about conserving aquatic biodiversity amid food system transformation. Welcome, Katie. Glad you're here.
All right. Thanks so much, everybody. I'm really glad to be here with you today. So I'm gonna start with a question. Who grew up in, we'll say, a fishing community of any type? A handful. Who lives in a community with a lot of fishing now? I think all of you, if you live in the Ithaca area. So we tend to think about fisheries in a silo, right? They don't always wind up in broader conceptions of the food system. And I'm hopefully going to convince you that we should really be integrating them into how we're thinking about food systems broadly. So as well as the people that work in and eat from them. So even if you haven't been a part of a fishing community, you may be someone who eats fish. And that connects us all really quite globally to the people who produce these foods. So my research group is really trying to examine how environmental and social changes affect ecosystems and people's health and well-being. And we do it in small-scale fisheries, in recreational fisheries, and in the sort of milieu of these spaces. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what's going on with aquatic food systems in a global sense, and then we'll look at a couple of specific places to think a little bit more about these systems. So aquatic food consumption is growing really rapidly. So fish are this, oops, looking the wrong way. So fish are this gray line here. A lot of animal source food consumption is growing really rapidly, fish right alongside it. So in addition to being a really unique source of omega-3 fatty acids, fish also contribute really substantial quantities of micronutrients. There is a lot of variation by species. We're going to talk more about that in a bit. But more than being just nutritious, fish are really seen as a sustainable source of these nutrients too. And so that is largely because when you hold up the greenhouse gas emissions of different animal foods, fish come out looking really good. This is especially true for wild fisheries, a little bit less true for fish produced by aquaculture. And increasingly, aquaculture is where we are getting our fish globally. So the growing demand for fish to consume is going to mean that we continue to harvest fish from wild systems in really large quantities. That's what you see here in blue. But it also means that we are increasingly going to be getting fish from aquaculture production, what you see here in yellow. So aquaculture is now more than half of the global fish produced. And as you can see in this graph, it's really rapidly expanding. It's the fastest growing food system segment today at 7.5% per capita growth. In 1961, the global per capita fish supply was about 9 kilograms per person. In 2022, it was over 20. So in contrast, wild fish production's been basically flat since the 80s. In some sense, this is a good sign that we are not seeing big dips in this production. A lot of our fisheries are fished at their capacity, many fished over their capacity. So sustaining this supply is not trivial, and we're getting more and more of our fish from these aquaculture systems. It's worth noting, however, that the large majority of that aquaculture production is in Asia. So aquaculture is also predominantly from freshwater fisheries. 62% of it comes from freshwaters. So what we think of as aquaculture and where it's actually coming from is not distributed evenly. So this shows per capita fish consumption, and the percentages at the top are the proportion that goes to these different global regions. And then the other thing to notice about this graph is the different color bars. And those link to different kinds of aquatic foods, right? So whereas we might think about chicken or beef as being one relatively similar class of foods, of course, there are different species of these too, aquatic foods have a tremendous amount of variation. And around the world, people's preferences, what they have access to, drives really different types of consumption of these different aquatic foods. And the other thing that this graph really highlights is just the degree of unevenness of aquatic food consumption around the world. Yet fish are among some of the most nutritionally important foods for vulnerable people. So dietary diversity, which folks may be familiar with, is this measure of how many food groups you regularly have access to. And it's a really good indicator of things like nutritional status. So if you're regularly eating, if you're a child, let's say, under 5 years old, if you're regularly eating from a bunch of different food groups, your nutritional status is much more likely to be adequate if you're getting more than 4 food groups a day than if you're getting less. So this is from a study that Lydia O'Meara, actually an Atkinson postdoc here at Cornell, led that looked at inland fisheries in some of the regions that depend most on them and the communities around them. And she found first that most children are not eating a nutritionally adequate diet by this dietary diversity measure. But then when you look at the actual foods that they're eating, they're getting a bunch of food groups. Most children are getting breast milk and grains. These are children under 2 years of age, I should note. A lot are getting another source of fruit and vegetables. Many are getting vitamin-rich vegetables. But what tends to be the hinge point in whether people are getting to this dietary diversity level that's nutritionally beneficial is whether or not they're eating an animal source food in their diet. So this tends to be the big hinge point. And that's, of course, because animal source foods are really expensive, right? And they're really nutrient dense. But when people are eating animal source foods, 20% of the people who are getting to this nutritionally adequate place, it's coming from fisheries. So this is a really substantial piece of this nutritional puzzle that often gets undercounted in these systems, how valuable they really are. Yet this is all amid a really big shift in what's going on in our marine and freshwater systems that supply these fisheries, right? So globally, biodiversity is declining. And the rapid decline in freshwater fish biodiversity is part of what is dragging the whole biodiversity curve down. So just as we have this whole set of diverse species that people are drawing from that are important parts of people's diets around the world, we're also seeing declines in this biodiversity. They're happening really rapidly. And so when we think about this aquatic food diversity, there are 31,000 fish that are described. This is a really substantial number. They all have different nutritional composition, right? Some are high in vitamin A, some are high in calcium. Others are relatively low in some of those important vitamins, and others have really high profiles for some of the fatty acids that we care most about nutritionally, others less so. So we have this huge diversity of species. And in places like the US, when we look at consumption levels here, people are predominantly eating a really small slice of those. So when you go to the grocery store around here, you are probably going to see a much more narrow selection of that diversity. But around the world, one of the big questions we've been asking is sort of how does this fish biodiversity actually support people's health and well-being, support access to nutritionally adequate diets, both because of the role that those different species have in ecosystems, and also because of the different nutrients they provide to people. And so one of the things I hope to underline for you is that species diversity really matters for nutrition for a bunch of reasons. So these fish are a small pelagic fish species called daga. They are in Lake Victoria that sits between Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, which is a place we'll talk more about in a little bit. But there are small fish species like this that support a lot of fisheries around the world. And so they're also larger fish species in the same lake, Nile perch and tilapia, and they're all really commonly harvested. So we did some work several years ago looking at the role that the type of fish plays in the breast milk fatty acids. So fatty acids being this really essential nutrient for brain development, incredibly important for young children. Their source of these fatty acids is from their mom through breast milk. And so when we look across different women and the different types of fish they're eating, we actually see a signal from the fish species that they're consuming that plays out in the fatty acids that actually appear in the breast milk. So in this community, people were all eating really high levels of fish, really high fatty acids in general. But the fact that you see that signal suggests the importance of these different species and taking into account that dynamic here. We've also looked at how fish access impacts early childhood development. So child development is a complicated thing to measure because children do various tasks at different times as they're developing, but the role that fish play in brain development suggests this relationship with child development. And so a lot of times that when people have studied this, they've looked at supplementation with fish oils as a way to improve nutrition, and they see beneficial outcomes. And what we did was look in fishing communities at how fish access affects pathways to early childhood development. And what we found here is that both consumption of daga, these small fish, is beneficially correlated with child development outcomes, but also that fishing income from some of the larger fish species in this system is beneficial for child development outcomes too, because of the whole suite of things that higher incomes do for households, right? So these two different species actually then give us these two different pathways to beneficial outcomes. And then the other thing that I want to highlight here when we're looking at this small fish is that these low-priced fish are a really vital, nutritious food. So what we find here is that largely, and this is a dynamic I think that's been observed in fisheries around the world, that people fish for high-value fish and they sell them. And they, at their households, consume a lot of these smaller, lower-priced fish. You know, we see this in the dynamics of smallholders around the world, right? They're really sensitive to prices because they're often net food buyers. And so this is true for a lot of fishers too. And so whether or not they have adequate access to fish was much more determined by whether they had income that supported that rather than the privileged access you might have from being a fisher. And this is a dynamic that we've also found in the fish supply around the world. So small pelagic fisheries tend to supply really abundant and affordable micronutrients in low and middle income countries. And so part of the reason that is because these fish are small. And so a small fish means that you're going to eat it whole. When you consume it whole, you're getting the nutrients that are in the head, that are in the bones. This is really nutritionally beneficial. They also just tend to be much less expensive, right? Fish fillets, the bigger plate-sized fish are prized in a lot of settings. They go for higher prices. So these fish are just more affordable. And because they're small, you can buy them in a smaller quantity, right? It's not hard for someone in the market to divide them up. And so this makes a really big difference, it turns out, in who can access different types of animal source foods and sort of the role that these fish play. They also really happily are largely much lower in mercury systematically around the world because they're lower trophic level species. They don't accumulate mercury, which bioaccumulates through the food chain. And they also regenerate much more quickly in the ecosystem. So these are a really important segment of the fishery that is also something that links to women's roles. A lot of times these fish are dried, and a lot of times the processing of these fish, women play a big role, especially in that sector of small-scale fisheries. So underlying the key importance of these small fish. And then the other thing I wanted to, in this sort of overview, really highlight is that globally, 1 in 12 people depends, at least in part, on small-scale fisheries. About half of those people are women, and they harvest about half of the fish that are caught globally. So we've had estimates, I think, of the proportion of people that are small-scale farmers for a really long time. This is actually a really new number. The 1 in 12 people participating in small-scale fisheries came out in a paper just last year, right? So these estimates that really are trying to understand what are the importance of these fisheries, I think that's something that's relatively new on the horizon, even if surprisingly so. And of course, this isn't evenly distributed around the world, right? So people who are fishing for their livelihoods much more likely to be living along coastlines, living along inland lakes, of course. And just the same as these ecosystems are really important for people's livelihoods, for the foods that they supply, they're also under threat, as many of our global ecosystems are. So this is a picture of Southeast Asia actually I'll use this so everyone can see. Southeast Asia, this is the Mekong River coming down through Southeast Asia. And these dots here are dams that are part of this food, energy, water nexus designed to provide the power that this growing population needs to support a lot of urbanization and growth of cities. But they also make a really big impact on the fishery. So we'll talk more about Cambodia, which is relatively low on the flow of the Mekong. It hits Cambodia second to last. And what the impact of damming this water and changing the flow of the river actually might be. A lot of fish are migratory. Part of their life history, salmon, a really common example, involves moving along the river. The eggs move, the fish themselves move, and stopping that process has a really big impact. And also just altering the flow of the water means that some of these places, if there's less water, there just is less habitat for all of these fish species too. Other really big threats are coming from eutrophication. This is a harmful algal bloom in Lake Victoria. We'll talk more about that dynamic later. Invasive species, a controversial issue to some extent, but the way these ecosystems are changing and their species composition can really alter their food system roles too. This is a fish species that was introduced by the British in the 60s to Lake Victoria and became the largest export fish from that lake for a long time. And then there's also just really a growing level of fishing pressure in a lot of these places. We're seeing population growth around the world. That's a widespread dynamic. These are actually from the Northeast, fish species and their thermotolerance. So climate change also having a really big impact on fisheries, and particularly so, I would argue, on inland fisheries, because they're distinct bodies of water. They're quite susceptible to warming. They're shallower. There's just less volume of water than in the ocean, right? Surely there are sensitive habitats in the ocean too, but and the fish can't necessarily move, right? So one of the big adaptations we see in marine systems is fish are going poleward, but you're not going to be able to do that in a lake. So the climate change effects on a lot of these systems are also potentially really dramatic. And this map shows the global trade in aquatic foods. So you might not think of fish as among the most widely traded food commodities, but they actually are. Not the easiest thing to move around the globe. You have to keep them frozen in a lot of cases, but they're really widely traded. So we have a really wide flow of fish around the world. In the United States, over 60% of the aquatic foods we consume are imported. So in some sense, we have control over the exclusive economic zones of the lakes and how they're managed. And we may or may not be doing a good job of that. But the reality is that the food that we're eating are coming from this really global set of fisheries. So what's happening in communities really far afield has a real connection to places that may be very far away through these chains. Okay, so we are going to look at a couple of dynamics that are tying what's going on with the ecosystem, with people's health, and with aquatic food systems. We're going to look in Cambodian inland fisheries to look at some of this, and also around Lake Victoria in Kenya. These are aquaculture cages, which are expanding really fast in that lake. Okay, so with that context in mind, and underlining again that 1 in 12 people globally work in small-scale fisheries like these ones, I'm going to show you how some of the fisheries in the Tonle Sap region work. So this is the Mekong River that comes down here, and this is the Delta area. And this lake here is the Tonle Sap Lake. So this is essentially in the middle of the country of Cambodia. And it's a source population of a lot of fish in the area. And so every year, the monsoon rains and the river flows swell this lake to about 5 times its size. And the water that flows in this lake goes out into these floodplains. The fish have a life history that really links to this system of this annual flood pulse. So fish move out when the water expands, they breed, they feed, they're signaled to come back as the water declines. And the extent of this flood determines pretty directly the amount of habitat that these fish have and how large their population is in a given year. And so hopefully you remember that I said this river is increasingly being dammed, impacting the whole dynamics of this system. And so in Cambodia, we wanted to try to understand better how people are experiencing the biodiversity in these fisheries, what they see as the future of this fishery. And so we used a participatory methodology called photo voice to do this. And so this is a participatory qualitative method where participants take photographs based on a prompt. So in our case, it is, what is the story of fish diversity in your life? And then they come back for interviews based on the photographs that they chose. And so this is just a wide swath of some of the photographs that participants in the study took. And I think one of the things that really jumped out to me immediately is just the wide diversity of species that people are using in their lives. So these are mostly cooking photos, but you can see we have mollusks, we have crabs, we have a bunch of different kinds of fish species. And people were really, really proud of this biodiversity and the fisheries that they had access to. So they said things like, it represents our good health, we have energy, fish have good vitamins, I feel happy when I get to fish to cook as food for our everyday life. Also, the biodiversity surrounding my community provides me enough variety of fish to support our livelihood. Therefore, we don't have to buy food from outside sources. But at the same time, people also really saw these fisheries as under threat, and really, in some communities, emerged as much more vulnerable to some of these threats, especially the ones that were really relying on the lake itself, as opposed to people that lived further in the floodplain and had more varied livelihoods. So people who were doing fishing, as well as rice farming and other types of wage labor. And people also really shared that sentiment very strongly. So this person said, we caught only a small quantity of fish. I'm upset when I think about making a living from this. The fish that I caught don't even fill up the container. It only filled up the bottom of the container. So people looking at their catch, I initially looked at this photograph and I thought this was a really beautiful photograph of someone's son. But actually, when she looks at this photo, she's really disappointed by what the yield here was. And so people were responding by moving away from fishing to focus on rice cultivation or lotus flower production. They were also asking a lot for additional enforcement and challenging what was being defined as illegal fishing. So there were really big concessions in this lake to more industrial fishers. People were really frustrated that there were nets that were being pulled around this whole lake, catching a ton of fish, and they're being cited potentially for fishing during an illegal season with a really small net, relatively. So there was a lot of frustration about the future of this fishery, too. And given that value of biodiversity in the ecosystem and the threats to it, we really designed this next study to better understand how biodiversity was operating in people's lives and how it moved from the ecosystem to people's dinner plates. So what we were trying to understand, we have a lot of senses that ecosystem biodiversity is good for people. And I shared some of those sentiments at the beginning of this talk. And we really wanted to understand, when there's more biodiversity in the ecosystem, how do people make use of that? And so we looked at these sites that you can see, the green sites here that are in the floodplains of Cambodia. They're community fish refuges. So they're community managed areas where people are protecting the fish. They're not fishing from them. So they essentially represent like a source population of fish that are being used to increase catch. And they're also, in our study, what we're going to use for a representation of the biodiversity that's available in the ecosystem. And we want to understand, how does that link to people's catch biodiversity? And so we compared the surveys of fish biodiversity that World Fish, which is an organization, did with data from households living nearby that documented what they caught and also what they did with it. So whether this fish species that they caught, whether they then went on to consume it or to sell it. And so what we found was that the number of species in the ecosystem was associated with the biodiversity of species caught, consumed, and sold. So all of these relationships held, and that on average, households were catching about 45% of the species in the ecosystem. They were consuming about 43% of them. So almost everything that they're catching, they're consuming. But they were selling just 9% of them. And so we find that the species that households sold were much more likely to be common, larger, and less nutritious, right? So they're these larger fish species that are fetching higher prices, but also that they're relatively less nutritious than a lot of the small species that are lower value that people are keeping to eat. But this also really highlighted for us the extent to which what's going on in people's catch and consumption may not be entering markets. So a lot of studies of fisheries that attempt to understand what's going on with them look at the market level of what's being sold there, or they look at some of the major fish species, they look at the production of them and try to understand the dynamics. But in really biodiverse, rich places like Cambodia, which I should have mentioned is the second most biodiverse place in the world for aquatic systems, second only to the Amazon, the sale biodiversity may be a really poor representation of the value of biodiversity in people's lives. So again, we looked at what actually then are the fish species that people direct to these different functions. So we found those ecological traits, and we also looked across the different households to try to understand, is this being shaped by different households behaving differently? So we looked to see if our estimates of how the ecosystem biodiversity affects consumption and sale biodiversity were modified when you take account for the fact that households have different income levels or they live different distances to markets. And we found actually that the relationships we saw were remarkably stable. So regardless of the differences in households, we still saw this association, but poorer households were on average eating more variety of species. So they were making more use of the biodiversity there. Okay. So folks like this man who represent a really large proportion of people fishing, how we understand and value biodiversity in these food systems could have a really big impact on the decisions that we make about things like energy production, whether the dams along the Mekong are beneficial. So the argument I want to make here is that the policy we ultimately make has really real consequences for people in these communities, but if we have failed to measure them or failed to measure their extent, we're also potentially going to misunderstand them. And these are real trade-offs that get made a lot in policy and thinking about, what would the impact be of the Tonle Sap no longer having this flood pulse system? There's a Cambodian MP who really famously said, we'll be in a great situation if people can go and see these fish in the museum. And we have great energy production and malls. But the reality is that a huge proportion of the population is fishing, and that Cambodia is the highest consumer per capita of inland fish consumption. So access to these resources is going to be important for a long time, too. Okay, so I'm going to move to another case to show you a little bit some of the work we've been doing around Lake Victoria, Kenya, too. Lake Victoria is Africa's largest freshwater lake. It's the second largest freshwater lake in the world. It's shared between Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. And we're going to focus here on the Kenyan side of the lake. This green-looking area, you might mistake it for land, is actually a piece of the lake, and this is especially the area we're going to hone in on. So 30 million people live in the Lake Victoria Basin. Hundreds of thousands of people are fishing on this lake. The fish supply from this lake is 1% of the global freshwater harvest, so a really tremendous resource. And the work that we're doing here is in partnership with the Kenya Marine and Fisheries Research Institute, the International Livestock Research Institute, and the Kenya Medical Research Institute. And here is our team at Cornell. So graduate students across disciplines and faculty across disciplines as well. And so we have a couple of big questions that we're asking here, both about the dynamics of aquaculture expansion and the human environmental impacts of harmful algal blooms. And so I'm going to touch on both of those a little bit. And so first, we're going to think about aquaculture. So Lake Victoria hosts the largest number of cage operations in African inland waters, and Africa is the site of the fastest growth in aquaculture production. So the most production is currently in Asia, but in Africa, production is growing the fastest. And a lot of it is happening through these cage operations. And so they have the advantage of being sited in existing water bodies. The infrastructure you need for them is relatively less compared to a pond, but they are really capital intensive. A lot of the investment comes up front, and then you wait for the harvest for close to a year. So I'm going to just play a quick video driving along the lake in a boat, showing the extent of these cages in some patches of the lake. So some places, they really just go on and on. They're really densely located and becoming more and more literally of a farmed system in this lake too. There are a whole bunch of different production systems amid this shift to aquaculture. So And what is being produced in these cages is largely tilapia. So tilapia are a fish that has long been in Lake Victoria. There are both native and introduced species of tilapia there. And the ones in the cage are Nile tilapia. Tilapia are a great aquaculture species, one of the globally biggest producers. They're pretty resilient. They can take tough conditions. And a lot of places in the world, they are very popular, including in Kenya. So in a lot of ways, the resurgence of caged aquaculture has made tilapia much more available to people, and it's because it had really been fished pretty hard in the wild because it's so preferred. There are also some other really interesting dynamics in that there's a lot of Chinese aquaculture that also produces tilapia, and these fish are imported to right next to Lake Victoria and integrated into the same channels and sold alongside it. It's really hard for people to tell the difference. There are definitely preferences for wild species, but there's a really interesting dynamic with sort of this global trade piece too. And there are real trade-offs between these different species. These are tilapia, these are daga that I showed you before. Daga are exactly the kind of fish that are both nutritionally really valuable and they would make great aquaculture feed, and they do. So increasingly, the aspiration is to turn the catch of daga into aquaculture feed to produce these higher value tilapia. So this is one dynamic that we're thinking about, modeling out sort of what are the nutritional implications of doing that, right? Who loses access to fish? Who gains it? And what do you really get for those kinds of trade-offs? I think these are questions and dynamics that we're seeing playing out around fisheries around the world. Do these small fish, which I'm telling you are so nutritionally valuable, do they become aquaculture feed? And what are the implications of that? There are a lot of dynamics going on with these cages. So you can see here, this is an algal bloom in one of the relatively lower tech versions of these cages. So the sophistication of these cages is increasing very quickly, but there's still a lot of relatively more locally produced cages with local materials. And around a lot of these settings, water quality is a real challenge. So this coincides with a global expansion of harmful algal blooms. And this is driven by a bunch of dynamics. So the blooms are fostered by nutrient runoff. We have a lot of algal species that can produce toxins. They're not, just because they can doesn't mean they're always producing a toxin. So sometimes we see algae and it's not harmful. Other times we see algae and it is harmful. And sometimes we see algae and it's harmful and it produces toxins. So these dynamics are complicated, but we do know that the harmful versions of these blooms are expanding around the world. And the implication of that both has to do with nutrient runoff, but it also has to do with climate change that makes warming conditions much more hospitable to these blooms. And in Kenya's Lake Victoria, we see these blooms, we see a lot of aquaculture expansion, and we're increasingly seeing a lot of loss of fish as well. So fish kills have been increasingly reported in the system. We did a survey with fish farmers to try to understand how common are these events. We found both a really punctuated and very well documented event in those news stories, but also that relatively substantial fish kills are happening pretty commonly. So farmers in this really burgeoning industry, huge growth of cages, a huge investment people are making up front, are seeing pretty substantial losses around these fish kill events. They attribute them to a whole range of things, from anthropogenic causes to water quality to fish disease. These are all very reasonable explanations. And we worked with ChemFree and had support from USAID for a little bit until it was canceled to try to investigate what of these factors might actually be happening. And our hypothesis was really that low water quality was stressing fish and increasing disease risks. So when fish are stressed, they're already in a relatively crowded environment, that they're very susceptible to diseases. And in an aquatic environment, diseases are just moving around. And so we did some pathogen surveillance. Oh, sorry, that's blurry. My apologies. Across the different counties, and found that pathogens were, in the red, were pretty regularly present when we looked at the fish, meaning that their susceptibility and stress events could be substantial. We also really wanted to understand what are the nutritional implications of these different production systems, and this has been a big question for people. So we compared the same species of tilapia in wild systems and cage systems. And these different pieces on the spider chart are different fatty acids. So we tend to be particularly concerned with adequacy of DHA and EPA. And what we find here actually is that the fatty acid profile of these wild and cage species is very similar, which has some interesting implications for the extent to which the feed that's going into these cages is actually being consumed by the fish, but is a really promising result for the value of these fish. And just for comparison, these are really small sample sizes, so don't read too much into this. But when we look in different kinds of aquaculture production systems, in ponds, in recirculating aquaculture, and in the imported systems, we see a different profile. And that's driven by the feed that the fish are consuming. So the fact that we don't see that here means both that these fish have really high levels of DHA and EPA, but it also presents some questions. So we have a lot of community monitoring going on to look at water quality dynamics, additional fish sampling, and ecological surveys. In this picture, you can see Horace, who's also right here in the room. And so students doing really great work on this and also developing some biological assays work. So I highlight this to tell you both that we have a lot of data and this work is very much ongoing, and that we also have opportunities for students to get involved. Should you be interested, please get in touch. And I'm going to wrap up here with this picture that we started with, and leave you with the thought that these freshwater ecosystems face a lot of pressures that face other types of food systems. So if you work in and are really passionate about a different system, I think you'll see lots of parallels in harvest pressure, habitat conversion, climate change, pollution, and more. And they also support a really astounding level of biodiversity and 1 in 12 people globally. And so I think that the image here that is really this man throwing out his net, this big question of what will he get when that happens, that fishers are always asking themselves, I think is very much a metaphor for the precipice that we all stand on, with the global decisions about the fate of small-scale fishers like this person, and the freshwater ecosystems that they rely on hanging in the balance. And so I think the scale of dependence, as much as it's a threat to these fisheries, it's also the opportunity for management that provides for them in the long term, for the food system and the ecosystem. So with that, I'll wrap up. Thank you all so much for listening.
Yeah, Katie, that was fantastic. Questions from the audience or comments? We'll start with one. One of the things that really interests me about going through this is the phases of the research that you've gone through and all the different methodologies that contribute to this. This implies a lot of work on your part, or the organizers of this program, to partner and to decide, once you've got one set of answers, how that sparks research to get the next set of answers. And I am curious about, what has been sort of the time span for this, and how have you kind of linked the different methodologies that you've used to tell this really deep story?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Time span is wide. I think the work in Cambodia grew out of a postdoc project that I did in 2015 to 2017. So it was probably the couple of years following that. And the work around Lake Victoria, both on aquaculture and harmful algal blooms, has been something we've been working on for the last 5 years. And I think one of the real strengths of this program has very much been the collaborators that we work with. And so, for example, one of the students in that picture of folks in the show he was a veterinarian by training before he did his PhD, right? So he brought a lot of expertise in fish health and fish diseases to the project that we could then use to investigate there. We have folks on our team with expertise in social sciences, in remote sensing, in public health and biomarker development. So we're often really looking to collaborate, to think about ways that we can address some of these questions. And I mean, there's also, Kenya is a really remarkable place. There's also just a lot of strength in the research centers there. So the Medical Research Institute, the Marine and Fisheries Research Institute, they have folks that are working on social sciences, that are working on limnology, that are working on medical questions. And so we've been really fortunate to be able to work with them on a lot of these questions too.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions?
Hey, thank you. I was just wondering two things. First, for the Kenyan project and the Lake Victoria, did you also look into like Tanzania and Uganda, since they have a larger share of the lake, and are the situations different there versus in Kenya?
Yeah, that's a great question. So our project focused in Kenya in large part because I don't know how to get. I guess you guys can't see that. Our project focused in Kenya because, in large part, the eutrophication of the lake. Let's see. I don't know. I might have botched this for you. Sorry. Oh boy. Okay. Sorry. I won't try to do it. But basically, Kenya's third largest city is situated on a gulf. It's Kisumu. And that gulf has relatively limited water circulation just by geography. And so the eutrophication of the lake is really concentrated there. And Kenya also has tended to be the first mover in the industrialization of production. So they have the smallest share of the lake, which you probably noticed, but they, for a long time, had the most fish packing plants when it was mainly a wild fishery. Now they, by far, have the most cage operations. So that's been the place that we've focused. But you're quite right that the dynamics in Tanzania and Uganda are different, and also, a really big part of this ecosystem and how it fits together. There are a couple lake-wide organizations that our partners at ChemFree work with pretty closely. But I've long thought that there is a lot of comparative potential in this lake, just as there's a lot of really interesting comparisons in the Great Lakes between what happens on the US and the Canadian side. I think these big international lake systems are really compelling ways to think about, different governance, different outcomes for sure. So the answer is no, but I think it's a great idea.
Any other questions?
I have another question. I love this stuff.
Yeah, your work on the harmful algae bloom, of course, that resonates with us here too, because it becomes a very rapidly increasing problem here on Cayuga Lake. And last summer we had more. The key indicator of how bad it's getting is when they have beach closures in public areas. So last year there were more beach closures than ever. And it's just been sort of this intractable problem in terms of what do we do about it, and a lot of finger pointing, a lot of blaming and so on. So I'm really curious, and not much action to fix it yet.
Mm-hmm.
But once it starts to become more of an economic problem, I do expect it'll draw more attention by policymakers. And my question here is most of the harmful algae bloom problem confined to these cages, or is it more widespread? And if it's confined to the cages, maybe, the policymakers will say, well, just clean up your cage. But if it's more widespread, maybe there'd be some reason to get some more action oriented toward it.
Yeah, it's definitely more widespread. There's a question about to what, when you put a cage of fish in the lake, the fish are defecating, you're putting feed in, how much of that feed they consume versus how much of it also just becomes nutrients in the lake is a question. So how much the cage aquaculture might be exacerbating it is a question. For a long time, the thinking was that most of the nutrient runoff came from Kisumu, from the waste management of the Kisumu, a very large city. And I think there are some indications now that it looks like more and more of it is coming from rivers that let out into the lake from agricultural runoff, which is, this really vexing problem of non-point source runoff. There are lots of things that people try to do about this. Not many of them are incredibly effective. I think there's more and more evidence that some of these buffers you can make alongside waterways have some benefits to reducing some of this. Yeah, and I think one of the questions we're really trying to drive at is we've been doing a lot of testing of fish in the lake to look at the extent to which they accumulate toxins that are produced by the blooms. Is maybe there is a health dynamic here also that becomes compelling. And part of the reason this work is based in Lake Victoria is because the intensity of the blooms is so high that some of the dynamics that might be hard to detect, some of the implications here, whether these toxins accumulate in fish that people are fishing for and then consuming, the amount of fish people are eating and the relative time that the blooms are there is just less than in this setting. But I think in a lot of ways, communities like this are a harbinger for what could be globally. And it's certainly true that it's a growing problem all across the US.
We have one quick question from our online audience. Thank you very much for the informative and stimulating presentation. My question is the relationship of your study to the US. I'm going to skip ahead a bit, but this person is wondering if you could tell us about how your study relates to the efforts to maintain health through seafood and omega-3 supplements and to the fisheries economy in the United States.
Yeah, great question. So I think so my answer to the last one might have partly answered that, but I think the other one really is just through, when we think about how much fish in the US is imported, it is upwards of 60% of it, right? And so the fish that you're eating in the US are very much from a global ecosystem. And so the supply of that is provided in half of the supply of those wild fisheries comes from small-scale fishers. So I think we often think about these kinds of fishers as really local, but their fish often enter a really global supply chain too. So I think the connections are often geographically far, but how we manage these ecosystems around the world can affect all of our dinner plates at the very least.
Great, thank you.